why I couldn't admit to having postnatal depression, not even to myself. I've always been a high achiever. You know the type, straight A's at school, a member of 2 orchestras, a graduate with a first-class honors degree, an award-winning journalist. Naively, I expected I'd be good at parenting too. When I was pregnant with my first child, I was working on a baby magazine. I remember reading a statistic about how much the average newborn cried, 2 hours a day, as I recall, and thinking, somewhat smugly, well, my baby won't cry that much. I couldn't have been more wrong. My son was a challenging baby from the start. He had dreadful colic, later diagnosed as reflux, and cried for way more than 2 hours a day. Night times were dreadful. I was lucky if I got 30 minutes sleep in between feeds. Daytimes were no better, endless hours spent pacing around our tiny terraced house with a screaming baby over my shoulder and pushing the pram through drab, gray November days in an attempt to soothe him to sleep. I'd expected to take motherhood in my stride. Instead, I was losing my mind. I'd been through bouts of depression in the past, but for some reason, it never occurred to me that I might be vulnerable to postnatal depression, PND. But thanks to the combination of hormones, sleep deprivation and a sense of complete inadequacy as a mother, I soon found myself in a pretty bleak place. In retrospect, I should have gone to the doctor, but I couldn't admit to anyone that I was struggling, not even myself. A big part of the problem was that, for the first time in my life, I felt like a failure. I'd never failed anything before, driving tests notwithstanding, and had assumed I'd take to motherhood with my usual aplomb. But I was completely out of my depth, unequipped to deal with the sense of helplessness I felt. I watched my antenatal class friends handling their quiet, contented babies with smiling assurance, and assumed I must be doing something horribly wrong. But admitting to the health visitor that I was finding things hard was out of the question. No one was allowed to know what a failure I was as a mother. I began to fear the involvement of my healthcare professionals. My son was failing to gain weight, a symptom of his undiagnosed reflux, and I already felt judged for my inability to nourish him properly. I was terrified that, if I let them see that I wasn't coping, I'd end up with social workers crawling all over me, threatening to remove my baby from my care. I couldn't even tell my family that things were difficult. In their eyes, I was clever, capable Lucy who got on with things without a fuss. I simply couldn't admit that I felt desperately out of control. Those were dark days. I remember breaking down during one particularly awful night and punching a wall. I had blazing rows with my husband. I fantasized about my old, child-free life. I turned to self-harm for the first time since I was a teenager. But I wouldn't let anyone help me. I wouldn't even let my husband change a nappy as I felt I should be capable of doing everything. Handing my baby over to his dad felt like an admission that I was failing. The guilt was unbearable. I felt guilty for not being the mother my son deserved. Guilty that I hadn't bonded with him. Guilty that at times, I wished I'd never even had a baby. 12 gorgeous gifts that new mums will love this Christmas. What not to say to a friend who has suffered an early miscarriage? When should you get rid of the stroller? And how do you do it? With hindsight, I can see that I was in a bad way. But at the time, the idea of asking for help was unthinkable. Now, how I wish I had. Maybe a course of medication or therapy would have lifted the blackness and put me back in control. Over time, things got better. Once my son was diagnosed with reflux and medicated accordingly, he became a lot more settled. Improved sleep followed, and by the time he was 18 months old, the clouds were lifting, but it could have been so much better, so much sooner, if I'd admitted I was struggling. I thought I was strong for battling on by myself, but now I recognize that it would have been so much stronger to ask for help. It can be difficult to admit to PND, but it doesn't make you a failure. The condition affects 10 to 15% of new mums, according to the Royal College of Psychiatrists. And if seeking help puts you in the position where you can, deservedly, enjoy your baby, It's got to be worth doing. More, the truth about parenting with a mental illness. More, self-care, it's not all bubble baths and scented candles. More, why self-harm isn't something just teenagers do.